decks in check, which is actually not a bad thing. Having good checks and balances in a standard format is really what makes it go. All right, welcome to another 902 Gaming video, and today I'm going to be going over my picks for most overvalued, overplayed, and likely to be tested the most heavily as soon as the set comes out. Even though when the card was originally spoiled, I had a little bit of worry about it. I thought it was a little bit broken, and then when I started thinking about it, I realized it's probably not as good as I would think. It's a good way for that specific deck to manage certain decks like Reanimator, and that card is Lion Sash. I had originally thought it was going to be very, very powerful, but then I started realizing the type of deck that this would go into would be, I thought it would go into mono white, but then I realized you're paying 2 mana for a 1/1 that does nothing until it starts exiling cards from graveyard. So it only gets bigger when you actually start exiling permanents from your opponent's graveyard. So when you're playing against that, so it will be the perfect sideboard card for that deck because it will give them a cheap answer to removing big threats and stuff like that. However, answers aren't always up to par with threats, and I don't think this one's actually up to par with threats. But I was a little perturbed because it was a very, very good hoser, I think, for the graveyard matchups. And I don't think it'll be much better than that. Because generally the mono white aggro deck doesn't tend to put a lot of permanents into your graveyard. So not really removing permanents. They're maybe using Sky Shroud Apparition or the Brutal Cathar or something like that to remove permanents. So they're not actually killing anything. Maybe Fateful Absence sometimes, but more often than not, they're not actually killing permanents. So they're not going to have ways to really take good use of this card. But I think people will test the crap out of it, and then I think people will come to the same conclusion that I did, that it's a little overvalued and maybe a little overhyped. Maybe I even overhyped it. I thought it was going to be this amazing card, and it will be an amazing card in certain circumstances, in certain matchups, but I don't think it'll go much further than that. Okay, next up we have, I'm going to get the obvious one out of the way right now, BoSeju, Who Endures. Now, this list isn't intended to be a list of cards that likely won't see play or anything like that. It's, I think, the card that's going to be played the most, or at least tested the most early on. Now, I don't know anything about Historic or any other older format or anything like that. This will likely be staples in any deck that plays green in those formats, and it likely will be a staple in Standard as well in any deck that plays green. It gives the mono green a way to remove troublesome artifacts and enchantments. Essentially, this will be played, but I don't think in the Standard format. I don't think it's just but just bonkers. I really don't think that. I mean, it'll help keep decks like Hallowed Haunting and stuff in check without having to play specific cards in your main deck. That's the one thing that this card does that I don't like, is you don't have to have dedicated artifact and enchantment removal anymore in the main deck. You can just pop 1 or 2 of these and you're good to go. It doesn't play well with Snowlands or anything like that, obviously, for obvious reasons too. But I think it will be one of the most played cards in Standard, but I think it'll just end up being a good card. I don't think it's broken. Again, I don't know about older formats. I'm sure it's insane in older formats where they play very few lands and they can have more answers now with this. But most of the time, this will just be a legendary land that comes into play and taps for green. You likely, much like the land spells that exist now, there's a certain dynamic that happens with them where you have to, determine whether or not it's worth it to, make your land drop or hold up for whatever spell you might be trying to use. And generally, it's better to make your land drop. So it could also be a possibility to see if play is a 4 of as well. So in other words, maybe the first 1 or 2 that you draw, you just end up playing them. You play them as land. Then if you draw them afterwards, they're basically just disenchants or Stone Rain for non-basics. I forget the name of it. But anyway, yeah, I think it's just going to be a good card. I don't think it's busted in Standard for sure. But time will tell, I guess. It may. The only problem with this type of card is it may keep certain decks like Hallowed Haunting, or anything like that, maybe curses, what have you, whatever it happens to be. It'll help keep those decks in check, which is actually not a bad thing. Having good checks and balances in a standard format is really what makes it go. And then next up we have, which is a personal pick, I guess, one that I want to play, and we'll see how it actually plays out. I don't know if the mana is going to be able to support it. I don't think that it will. Ishin to Heavens is one, and I spoke about this in my preview/review spoiler video, where I said this would be the one card that will make or break the single attack samurai deck viable or not. And thankfully it actually is in the set, and it's not part of like Commander or anything like that, which is great. I like to see cards like this that have some broken abilities for, that may spawn off a certain archetype or what have you. And if that deck sees play, it'll be because of this guy and the ability. As long as you're able to cast him reliably on turn 3, even sometimes maybe even on turn 4, that shouldn't matter that much. If the samurai deck happens to be a thing, it'll be because of this guy here. And he causes, every attacking creature will cause a triggered ability of a permanent you control to trigger. That ability triggers additional time. So it actually isn't even tied to the samurai mechanic, quote unquote samurai mechanic, because it doesn't say attacking alone. So there is a lot with the samurai mechanic in general, I think, and that the samurai mechanic is just a creature attacking alone. And there's quite a few of them in this set. Just remains to be seen if it'll be viable or not. This could be completely busted in any like draft or sealed as well. Again, it'll just be a matter of if you can cast it or not. I don't necessarily put this in the overvalued side of this video. I think it's just it's going to be played. People are going to test it a lot because people like that sweet combination where you can get one card and then do double triggers, and people love that kind of stuff. So next up we have Kaito Suzuki, new Planeswalker. And I think this guy will be heavily tested at first in the ninjutsu deck. I think people will find out that he's not quite as good as he might be, or that he might seem to be. And then once people start fine-tuning that deck, I think you'll see this card pop back into that deck. I think in the beginning, I think people aren't going to know how to build the deck properly. And I do think it'll be at least a viable deck. I don't know if it'd be the best deck in the format, but I think the blue-black ninjutsu rogue deck will be a good card. Will be a good deck, in this format coming up. And I think eventually people will come back to this card and be like, oh, this card is actually really, really, really strong. Yeah, this is just one of those ones I think will be tested early on, be way overvalued in the beginning, and then as the format kind of goes on, it'll come back and be a better card later. I do like the fact that it phases out, so it does protect himself. And I think it'll be more for the creating the unblockable creature that'll be used for the most. But yeah, that's where I see this card lining up in the standard format to come. And then we have the last one, which I think just about everybody has been talking about. It's highly likely that this becomes incredibly busted and, has to be adjusted. And that is Eater of Virtue. And the reason I put it in this one is because just about everybody's going to try to fit it in every single deck that they play with that has some moderate amount of creatures. Just because it for 1 mana, you get to equip to a creature and the creature gets +2/+0. I think that's just good. Just in and of itself, I think it's good. But I think people don't realize that a creature has to die, number 1, and then it has to have one of the abilities, and then you have to have another creature to be able to equip it to. Again, it is sweet when it works, and it likely will work approximately maybe 50% of the time, where you'll have this on a creature that has flying. But then when you actually look at all the keyworded mechanics that are on here, and then compare that with all the cards that are actually playable in the format, you kind of run out. There's not a ton. Like flying's probably the most common one, maybe followed by First Strike. And in that context, generally a flying First Strike doesn't usually meet too much opposition. So I think in that context, it won't be as broken as I think it initially. That people thought it might be. I still think it's a very good equipment. I think it'll see play. I think it's going to see a ton of play, especially early on. But I don't think it'll be as broken as I initially thought. I think it's going to be played a lot. And I think it's going to be probably much like Kaito. I think it's going to be overplayed in the beginning. People are going to be like, oh, wow, it's really not that great. And then people will either start to build around it. And then as the decks evolve, then it will start finding its way back in. I think people are going to put it in just about everything. I think it's much like Hallowed Haunting. Again, I talk about that card all the time. Hallowed Haunting in the beginning, people were just trying to, they were using, even myself, I have a bunch of Esper Curses deck in my video logs here, and it was a card that people thought was just, oh, it's not good enough, and it wasn't built quite properly. And then when you start seeing the decks that start getting built much better, and new cards are added, and cards that people didn't think of before, like the runes and all that kind of stuff, and you start realizing it can start operating like a combo deck, then like something like Hallowed Haunting becomes much better card. All right, so yeah, that's Eater of Virtue. Again, I think it's going to be played for sure. But I think it's going to be one of these cards that comes around later. I think actually most of these cards, maybe except for BoSeju, is going to be the same sort of thing. When the format starts evolving and the threats start changing, these cards will start coming back. People will be like, oh, I thought this was really sweet, and it's really not that sweet. Anyways, that'll do it for this video, and hopefully you enjoyed it, and I will see you in the next one.